It was a quiet June night in 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, a town so peaceful that people didn't even lock their doors. But by morning, the Moore family home would become the site of one of the most horrifying and brutal unsolved mass murders in American history. 8 people, 6 of them innocent children, bludgeoned to death in their sleep with the blunt end of an axe. Mirrors were covered. Faces were draped with cloth. The killer moved with chilling precision, leaving behind no clear motive, no fingerprints, and no justice. Over a century later, the house still stands, as if time froze the terror in its walls. Was it a traveling preacher? A jealous neighbor? Or a cold-blooded serial killer passing through? This is not just a murder story, it's a ghost story, a psychological puzzle, and a window into the darkest corners of the human soul. Welcome to the Villisca Axe Murders, the crime that shattered a town and still haunts America to this day. In the early summer of 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was the very image of small-town tranquility. Nestled in the southwestern part of the state, it was a town where children played freely in the streets, where doors were rarely locked, and where neighbors knew each other not just by name, but by their routines, their families, and even their voices. Life moved at a steady, predictable pace. The residents were modest, hardworking, and tightly knit, bound together by church gatherings, school events, and the rhythms of rural life. For many, Villisca was more than just a place, it was a way of life defined by simplicity, security, and community trust. With a population just under 2,000, Villisca didn't often make headlines. The town was modest but flourishing, thanks to its role as a rail hub in the region. Trains passed regularly through the small depot, bringing goods, passengers, and the occasional traveling preacher or salesman. Main Street was lined with general stores, a post office, and small businesses run by families who had lived there for generations. Church bells chimed on Sundays, and life followed a rhythm that hadn't changed much in decades. One of the central families in the town was the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, a respected businessman, was well known for his successful hardware store. He was seen as dependable, upright, and ambitious. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was active in church and community events, particularly with the Presbyterian congregation. Together, they had 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, all of them well-mannered and loved by their peers and teachers alike. The Moores were not rich, but they were comfortable and content, living in a white 2-story house on the corner of East 2nd Street and still very much part of the heartbeat of the town. Church played a big role in the town's culture. It wasn't just a religious obligation, it was a social cornerstone, a place where relationships were formed, announcements were shared, and trust was built. Most families, including the Moores, were regular attendees. Sarah Moore was particularly active in the local Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a yearly tradition that involved music, recitation, and children performing short biblical scenes for the congregation. It was an event that brought out nearly the whole town. June 9, 1912, was a Sunday like many before it. The weather was warm, the skies clear, and the church was filled with families. That evening, the Moores attended the Children's Day program, where their kids participated alongside 2 young guests, Ina and Lena Stillinger, sisters aged 8 and 12. The Stillinger girls had come to stay the night with the Moore children after the program, as they were friends of the family and frequently played together. It wasn't unusual for kids to have impromptu sleepovers in Villisca, and it was even more common after church events that ran late into the evening. Nothing about that day hinted at the tragedy to come. The town's pace hadn't changed. People waved to each other across fences. Horses pulled carriages past the dusty roads. There were no sirens, no warnings, no hint of the horror that would soon unfold under the cover of darkness. Villisca was not a place where evil felt possible. The sense of safety was so deeply ingrained that no one would have thought to question it. The idea of locking doors was almost laughable. Who would do such a thing in a town where everyone knew everyone? The people of Villisca shared more than geography, they shared values, routines, and mutual dependence. Children could walk home from school on their own. Women could leave laundry on the line and return hours later to find everything untouched. People left keys in their carriages. Gossip was minimal, and disputes rarely escalated beyond quiet disagreement. There was a sense that life in Villisca operated on a kind of unwritten code: respect your neighbor, take care of your family, and contribute to the good of the community. It was this exact sense of peace and order that made what happened next so devastating. The town's innocence wasn't just shattered, it was obliterated in a single night. What happened in the Moore house would mark the end of Villisca as it had been known. Overnight, it went from being a quiet Midwestern town to a national symbol of terror, its name forever tied to a brutal and incomprehensible crime. No one in Villisca could have anticipated how drastically their world was about to change. The crime that would take place in the Moore household was not only horrifying in its violence, but incomprehensible in its coldness. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of it all was the timing. That night, after the prayers were said and the children were tucked in bed, the killer, or killers, were already inside. Hidden in the shadows. Waiting. Watching. And no one suspected a thing. The next morning, Villisca would wake up to a silence it had never known. A silence heavy with death, confusion, and fear. And the town's name would never be spoken the same way again. The Moore family was a well-regarded and integral part of Villisca's small but closely connected community. Josiah B. Moore, the head of the family, was a hardworking and respected businessman who operated a thriving hardware store in town. Known to his friends as Joe, he had built a solid reputation through years of reliability, integrity, and quiet ambition. He had previously worked for Frank F. Jones, another local businessman, before venturing out to establish his own enterprise. His departure from Jones's employ would later become a focal point of speculation and whispered suspicion after the tragedy that befell his household. Josiah was a man of few words but strong principles. He attended church regularly, took pride in his business, and was devoted to his family. His commitment to his work and his values made him a role model for younger men in the town. Many admired his journey from employee to store owner, viewing him as proof that persistence and character could still carve a path to success in the early 20th century Midwest. He wasn't wealthy by any grand measure, but he had built a good life, one he had every reason to be proud of. Sarah Montgomery Moore, Josiah's wife, was equally admired. She was active in the Presbyterian Church and known for her kind demeanor, intelligence, and organizational abilities. Sarah played a key role in the church's events and had recently overseen the planning and execution of the Children's Day program, a festive religious occasion that involved musical performances and readings by the local children. She was well liked by other women in the community and considered a dedicated mother and devout Christian. Her energy and gentleness created a nurturing environment in the Moore household. Together, Josiah and Sarah had 4 children: Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Herman, the oldest at 11, was bright and responsible. Catherine, aged 10, was cheerful and curious, often seen following her older brother or helping her mother with chores. Boyd, 7, had a mischievous streak but was lovable and playful, often getting into harmless trouble that made adults smile rather than scold. Paul, the youngest at just 5 years old, was the quietest of the group, often holding tightly to his mother's hand in public and staying close to home. The Moore children were known throughout Villisca as polite, well-raised, and sociable. They regularly participated in school activities and church events and were frequent playmates to other children in the neighborhood. There was nothing unusual or controversial about the family. They were, in every sense, ordinary and decent, a portrait of middle American life in the early 1900s. The evening of June 9th was supposed to be a joyful one for the family. After weeks of preparation, Sarah's work with the Children's Day program was finally coming to life. As one of the town's most anticipated church events, the program drew a large crowd of families. It was an opportunity for the community to come together, celebrate the youth, and strengthen social bonds. The Moore children were all involved in the program, as were many of their friends, including Ina and Lena Stillinger, who were invited to spend the night at the Moore home afterward. The Stillinger sisters were daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, another well-known family in the region. Ina, aged 8, and Lena, 12, were responsible, smart, and polite. They had attended the Children's Day program with the intention of returning home afterward, but plans changed, as they often did in tight-knit communities. After the event ran later than expected, arrangements were made for them to stay overnight with the Moores, a decision that felt natural and convenient at the time but would later become a painful footnote in a devastating narrative. Lena and Ina were not strangers to the Moore household. They had spent time there before, and their families shared a friendly rapport. The sleepover, spurred by the late church event and a simple desire to continue the evening's camaraderie, was as spontaneous as it was innocent. No one could have imagined that it would mark the final hours of their lives. Within the Moore home, the atmosphere that evening would have likely been one of contentment and exhaustion. After a long day of church festivities and social interactions, the family returned home accompanied by their young guests. It was a scene of normalcy that played out countless times across rural America, children bathed and tucked into bed, parents reviewing the day, perhaps some quiet conversation or preparation for the coming week. It was, by all appearances, the definition of safety, routine, and family life. But beneath that surface of calm and familiarity, something unimaginable was already in motion. Unknown to the Moores or the Stillinger girls, someone, or something, was preparing to violate that space of safety. A presence had either already entered their home or would do so under the cover of darkness. And once inside, the boundaries between peace and horror, innocence and brutality, would be obliterated. The presence of the Stillinger sisters in the home would later intensify the emotional weight of the case. Not only was an entire family lost, but 2 children from another household were pulled into the vortex of tragedy, extending the grief far beyond one family and into the heart of the wider community. For the Stillinger family, it was a night that should have ended with their daughters returning home safely the next morning, a routine sleepover that would, instead, end in silence, sorrow, and lifelong pain. This convergence of 2 families in one house, on one night, in a town that had never known such darkness, would forever alter the story of Villisca. 8 lives were about to be taken, not through accident, not through illness, but through a deliberate and calculated act of evil. And the victims, each one blameless, each one unaware, went to sleep never knowing that they would never awaken. Monday morning, June 10, 1912, began like any other for most of the residents of Villisca. The air was warm with the promise of a summer day, and the town was still basking in the afterglow of the previous night's successful church program. But as the town stirred to life, subtle irregularities began to raise concern, particularly in the minds of neighbors and townsfolk who had come to expect the reliable rhythms of the Moore family's routine. Mary Peckham, the Moores' next-door neighbor, was the first to feel that something was amiss. Sarah Moore was usually up early, tending to her chores or stepping outside to begin her morning routine. When the house remained unusually quiet and no signs of activity could be seen from the windows or backyard, Mary's concern began to grow. She waited for a while longer, glancing over occasionally, expecting to see movement or hear the familiar bustle of the Moore children. But nothing came. By around 8 a.m., her discomfort had grown into unease. She walked over and knocked on the Moore's door. There was no answer. She called out, then tried the door, but it was locked. The silence inside felt heavy and unnatural. Eventually, she let the Moore family's chickens out of the coop, attempting to maintain some semblance of routine while debating what to do next. Unable to shake her worry, she finally contacted Josiah Moore's brother, Ross, who arrived not long after. Ross Moore, a man who shared his brother's reliable nature, took the concern seriously. He knocked, called out, and then used his spare key to unlock the front door. What he encountered inside would fracture the calm fabric of Villisca forever. Though the exact details of his initial discovery were not publicized immediately, what is known is that within minutes, Ross exited the house in shock and summoned authorities. The local marshal, Hank Horton, responded quickly. As word spread, people began gathering near the house, drawn by the sudden appearance of police and whispers of something terrible. Horton entered the home, and what he saw was beyond comprehension. Inside the Moores' peaceful, modest house, all 8 occupants, Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger girls, had been brutally murdered. Each had been bludgeoned to death, and most appeared to have been killed in their sleep. The attack had been methodical and intimate. A heavy axe, presumed to be the murder weapon, had been used with relentless force. Some victims had been struck multiple times, and the ceilings in some rooms bore the dark stains of the aftermath. The killer, or killers, had moved silently through the house, leaving no one alive. What made the discovery even more disturbing were the deliberate and eerie touches found throughout the crime scene. Mirrors and glass surfaces had been covered with cloth or clothing. Curtains were drawn tightly. A piece of raw bacon was left in the guest room, along with a bowl of water that may have been used by the killer to wash their hands. The Stillinger girls, who had only been guests for the night, were found in the downstairs guest bedroom. It appeared that Lena, the older sister, may have been awake during the attack. She was discovered in a position suggesting movement, possibly an attempt to escape or resist. There were hints of a struggle, but no one would ever be able to say for sure what happened in those last, horrifying moments. As news traveled, shock gave way to horror, then to fear. Villisca, a town of around 2,000 people, was suddenly gripped by panic and confusion. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was an atrocity. For a community rooted in tradition and trust, the concept of such evil entering one of their own homes was nearly impossible to comprehend. The fact that children had been targeted with such violence only deepened the psychological wounds. Parents clutched their own children tighter, and the friendly openness that once defined the town began to erode under the weight of suspicion. What disturbed many the most was the apparent ease with which the killer had moved through the house. No signs of forced entry were initially found, and nothing of value seemed to have been taken. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a random act of violence by someone passing through looking for money or goods. It was something darker, something more personal or deeply disturbed. The killer had taken their time. The killer had remained inside long enough to alter the scene. And most chillingly, the killer had left without being seen or heard. Law enforcement faced immediate pressure to find answers. But Villisca was not equipped to handle such a complex and gruesome crime. The town had no real experience with murder, much less a massacre. News outlets quickly descended upon the scene, and soon, the entire state of Iowa was aware of what had occurred. What had once been a quiet, almost anonymous farming town was now the center of one of the most horrifying crime stories in American history. Speculation ran wild. Some believed it must have been someone local, someone who knew the layout of the house, the family's routines, and the best time to strike. Others feared it was the work of a madman, a drifter with no connection to the town at all. But with no clear motive, no surviving witnesses, and a crime scene that offered more dread than clues, the case was already beginning to look like it would resist easy answers. The morning had begun with stillness. By the end of the day, that stillness had curdled into collective dread. The people of Villisca, once content and secure in their way of life, now found themselves looking over their shoulders, locking their doors, and wondering whether a monster lived among them. In the aftermath of the Villisca Axe Murders, law enforcement officials were immediately thrust into a position of unprecedented responsibility and confusion. The brutal slaying of 8 individuals in their sleep was unlike anything the local authorities had ever encountered. Marshal Hank Horton, who had discovered the bodies, quickly realized that the scope of this crime extended far beyond the capabilities of the small-town police force. The investigation that followed was marred by poor coordination, contamination of evidence, and the overwhelming pressure of public scrutiny. The first critical error occurred almost immediately: the crime scene was not secured. As word spread about the massacre, townspeople poured into the Moore residence out of morbid curiosity and concern. Dozens, possibly over 100, locals wandered through the house before officials finally cordoned off the area. Some accounts even mention that people took souvenirs from the scene, a disturbing reflection of how the lines between crime and spectacle were quickly blurred. The result was catastrophic for forensic integrity. Any potential evidence, footprints, fingerprints, blood traces, or items left by the killer, was trampled, moved, or stolen before it could be examined properly. The lack of standardized forensic practices in 1912 further hampered the investigation. This was a time before modern crime scene protocols, DNA analysis, or even reliable fingerprinting. Investigators relied largely on physical observation, interviews, and gut instinct. At the crime scene, the axe was discovered leaning against a wall in the guest bedroom where the Stillinger girls were found. The weapon appeared to belong to Josiah Moore himself, suggesting it had been taken from the home and used in the attack. But without conclusive evidence to link the weapon to a suspect, it remained a terrifying symbol rather than a key piece of proof. Investigators also noted the strange and ritualistic elements of the scene. The coverings over the mirrors, the bowl of bloody water, the food left on the kitchen table, all were interpreted in different ways. Some speculated that the killer may have had religious or superstitious motives. Others believed these gestures were part of a calculated attempt to mislead investigators. Regardless of intent, the meaning of these details would remain ambiguous and contribute to the aura of mystery surrounding the case. Law enforcement agencies from outside Villisca began to get involved as the story attracted regional and national attention. Detectives from nearby towns, as well as private investigators, arrived to offer their theories and assistance. The town's mayor requested help from the Iowa State Bureau of Investigation, but jurisdictional boundaries and a lack of centralized authority caused delays and confusion. Competing factions formed within the investigative team, each pushing their own suspect or theory, often working at cross purposes. Suspicion fell upon a range of individuals, some based on tenuous circumstantial evidence, others merely because they fit a perceived criminal profile. One early suspect was a local transient, a drifter seen in town the night of the murders. Another was Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and former employer of Josiah Moore. Jones and Moore had a well-known rivalry, and Josiah's decision to leave Jones's company and start his own competing business had caused a significant rift. Some speculated that Jones harbored a deep resentment, and rumors swirled that he may have hired someone to eliminate his former employee. However, no concrete evidence ever tied him to the crime. Another person of interest was Reverend George Kelly, an itinerant preacher with a troubled past and disturbing behavior. He had been in Villisca the night of the murders, attended the same church event as the Moore family, and had left town early the following morning. Kelly would later confess to the murders, only to recant shortly afterward. His confession was inconsistent and riddled with contradictions, leading many to believe it was a product of his mental instability rather than a genuine admission of guilt. Despite this, he would remain one of the most discussed figures in the case, eventually being tried twice, with both trials ending in failure to convict. The psychological toll on the town was profound. Rumors flourished in the absence of solid answers. Friends began to suspect friends, neighbors eyed each other with unease, and the sense of communal trust that had once defined Villisca began to erode. Some families left the town altogether, unwilling to remain in a place now synonymous with horror. Others became obsessed with the case, dedicating themselves to amateur detective work or collecting news clippings in the hope of discovering some overlooked clue. The murders had become an open wound on the town's conscience, festering in silence and suspicion. What could have been a straightforward investigation quickly spiraled into chaos. Evidence was compromised, suspects were mishandled, and public pressure led to hasty decisions rather than thoughtful analysis. The tragedy had exposed not just a crime, but the limitations of an early 20th century justice system unprepared for such a monstrous act. Despite the efforts of numerous investigators, the case became mired in dead ends, conflicting testimonies, and legal missteps. By the end of the first month, it was clear that no one had a definitive answer. And as the days stretched into weeks and months, the murders at Villisca slowly shifted from a fresh wound to a cold case, still raw in memory, but distant in resolution. The investigation, once driven by urgency, now seemed to drift into a fog of missed opportunities and unfulfilled justice. As the investigation faltered under the weight of public panic and procedural mishandling, the search for suspects took on a frantic, often irrational energy. Law enforcement and townspeople alike were desperate to find someone, anyone, to hold accountable. What emerged was a lineup of suspects, each with motives that ranged from plausible to purely speculative, reflecting not only the gravity of the crime but also the fears and prejudices of the time. One of the earliest and most enduring suspects was Frank Fernando Jones, a respected Villisca businessman and former Iowa state senator. His name came up not because of any direct evidence, but due to a long-standing business and personal feud with Josiah Moore. Moore had once worked for Jones, managing his farm equipment business. However, Moore left the firm in 1907 and started a rival business, reportedly taking some of Jones's best customers and valuable suppliers with him. There were whispers that Moore had been involved in an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no substantial proof ever supported such rumors. Frank Jones maintained his innocence throughout, and no forensic evidence ever connected him to the crime scene. However, the idea that Jones might have hired someone to commit the murders, specifically, a professional killer named William Blackie Mansfield, gained traction. Mansfield had a violent past and was later accused of killing his wife, infant child, and in-laws in a similar manner using an axe. The killings bore eerie similarities to the Villisca murders, including the use of the blunt end of the axe and the covering of mirrors and windows. Yet, despite these parallels, Mansfield had an alibi supported by payroll records and was released after a brief detention. The most peculiar suspect of all was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a reputation for erratic behavior and dark obsessions. Kelly was known to have been in Villisca on the night of the murders, attending the same Children's Day service at the Presbyterian church where the Moore family had participated. He had a history of mental illness, voyeurism, and sexual deviance. His behavior both before and after the crime raised numerous red flags. He left town early the next morning, sent suspicious letters to investigators, and reportedly showed an unusual interest in the case. His bizarre tendencies, coupled with his proximity to the crime, made him a focal point of suspicion. Years later, George Kelly would confess to the murders during a lengthy interrogation. However, the confession was riddled with contradictions and seemed more a product of psychological manipulation than truth. Kelly later recanted, and many believed his unstable mental state rendered anything he said unreliable. He was tried twice for the Villisca murders. The first trial ended in a hung jury, the second resulted in an acquittal. Despite the dramatic courtroom proceedings, no concrete evidence ever definitively tied him to the crime. Others who found themselves under suspicion were less notorious but equally unfortunate. Numerous transients and vagrants were questioned, detained, and in some cases, publicly accused. The nature of the crime, a sudden, gruesome massacre, seemed to feed into the era's anxieties about outsiders and the mentally unwell. One man, a traveling serial killer named Paul Mueller, was later considered by some crime researchers to be a plausible suspect, linking the Villisca case to a string of similar family murders committed across the Midwest between 1898 and 1912. The theory suggested that Mueller targeted entire households, preferred using axes, and covered windows and mirrors in the same fashion as seen in Villisca. Yet, this theory came decades later and lacked definitive proof beyond circumstantial patterns. Over the years, the suspect pool continued to expand rather than narrow. Forensic limitations of the time meant that evidence couldn't be thoroughly examined or preserved. Polygraph tests, blood analysis, and fingerprint comparisons were either rudimentary or non-existent. This lack of scientific clarity left room for conjecture, rumors, and personal vendettas to fill the void. The case became a magnet for amateur sleuths, journalists, and opportunists, all eager to unmask the phantom figure behind the killings. The public's desire for closure was palpable. In a town as small and close-knit as Villisca, the idea that a murderer had walked freely among them, possibly someone they knew, was unbearable. This fear gave rise to internal suspicions, dividing the community and turning neighbors into potential threats. Even those completely uninvolved found themselves scrutinized under the harsh light of collective grief and paranoia. Some moved away to escape the stigma. Others grew reclusive, unwilling to relive the trauma or speak about that night ever again. Despite the intense scrutiny placed on these suspects, none were ever convicted. Each lead eventually dried up, each name eventually fell into ambiguity, and the killer, or killers, remained anonymous. What persisted was not a clear narrative of justice, but a catalogue of human flaws, errors in judgment, failures in procedure, and the devastating consequences of a crime left unsolved. The Villisca murders had created not only victims within the Moore household but also a web of collateral suffering, lives destroyed by accusation, reputations ruined by association, and a town forever haunted by the shadows of its own suspicion. The house at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, became the embodiment of fear in the days following the murders. Inside its modest wooden frame, the brutality inflicted upon the Moore family and their two overnight guests shocked investigators, horrified locals, and confounded even the most hardened lawmen. The scene that officers and townspeople discovered on the morning of June 10, 1912, was not just one of death, it was one of calculated, ritualistic cruelty. The attack had taken place sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. All 8 victims, Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 visiting girls, Ina and Lena Stillinger, were found bludgeoned to death in their beds. Each had been struck repeatedly with the blunt end of an axe. What stood out was the quiet, almost methodical nature of the killings. There were no signs of a struggle, no cries for help heard by neighbors, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if death had swept silently through the house in a single, unstoppable wave. Investigators noted that the killer had first targeted Josiah and Sarah Moore. Josiah's face had been so badly beaten that his eyes were reportedly missing. The axe wounds were delivered with such force that gouges were left in the ceiling above the bed, likely from the upswing of the weapon. Sarah, lying next to her husband, was struck with similar violence. The same fate met their children, one by one, in their shared room across the hallway. Each child's body was discovered with their heads covered, blankets, clothing, or sheets pulled gently over them post-mortem. This disturbing detail suggested a sense of shame or remorse from the killer, or perhaps an eerie ritual meant to obscure the horror he had wrought. The Stillinger sisters, who had been invited to spend the night after the Sunday church service, were found last in the guest bedroom on the first floor. While Ina's death appeared similar to the others, Lena's condition puzzled investigators. Her body had defensive wounds, suggesting she may have awakened during the attack. Her nightgown was reportedly pulled up, and she was found partially disrobed, hinting at a possible sexual motive. However, no evidence of assault was confirmed. It was an ambiguity that further complicated the case, and darkened the killer's psychological profile. Equally unsettling were the inexplicable choices the murderer made after the killings. All mirrors in the house had been covered either with sheets or pieces of clothing. Windows were blocked from view, curtains drawn tightly shut, and in some cases, glass panes covered with garments. The Moore family's telephone had been dismantled, its parts removed as if to delay communication. The murder weapon, Josiah Moore's own axe, was left leaning against the wall in the guest room, its handle wiped clean but the blade still sticky with blood and tissue. A 4-pound slab of bacon was discovered wrapped in cloth near the axe, a bizarre and unexplained inclusion in the crime scene that only added to the case's surreal atmosphere. A plate of uneaten food was found on the kitchen table, alongside a bowl of bloody water. Some theorized that the killer had lingered after the murders, calmly washing up before departing. The presence of the food and the clean axe handle suggested a level of detachment that deeply unsettled investigators. This was not a frenzied attack by an enraged assailant, it appeared deliberate, controlled, and disturbingly calm. Adding to the macabre picture was the realization that the murderer may have been in the house long before the attack occurred. Some detectives speculated that he had hidden in the attic above the children's room, waiting silently until the household was asleep. Shoe prints and scattered cigarette butts found in the attic supported this theory, indicating a calculated plan rather than a spontaneous act. It suggested that the killer had chosen his moment with great care. He had watched, waited, and then descended into unimaginable violence. There were no fingerprints collected, partly due to the primitive forensic techniques of the time and partly due to contamination. Dozens of curious townspeople had trampled through the house before the crime scene was secured, muddying evidence and rendering key forensic details unusable. The axe itself, a potential treasure trove of clues, was handled multiple times before any proper analysis could be conducted. The crime scene had been reduced to chaos by the very people desperate for answers. This failure to preserve the evidence sealed the fate of the case in many ways. Important items were lost, misidentified, or corrupted beyond use. Potential clues, such as the killer's route through the house, his entrance and exit, or any items he may have touched, were rendered unreliable. The Villisca house, once a place of warmth and family life, became a cautionary tale not only of horror but of how haste and hysteria can compromise justice. Decades later, forensic specialists and amateur detectives would return to these details, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events and decipher the killer's mind. But each clue seemed to lead only to more questions. Why cover the faces of the victims? Why take the time to block out light and reflections? What purpose did the slab of bacon serve? The Villisca crime scene was a tapestry of death, ritual, and psychological complexity, an enduring mystery that invited endless speculation but no satisfying conclusion. As the gruesome reality of what had occurred inside the Moore home began to circulate through the quiet streets of Villisca, the town was quickly overwhelmed by a wave of fear, confusion, and disbelief. News of the massacre spread with lightning speed, fueled by whispers, rumors, and the haunting realization that a killer had walked silently through the heart of a peaceful community and vanished without a trace. For a town that had prided itself on its safety and neighborly bonds, the murders shattered a sense of innocence that would never fully return. In the hours following the discovery, the Moore house transformed into a chaotic epicenter of grief and panic. Townspeople arrived in droves, many out of concern, others driven by grim curiosity. The initial lack of law enforcement control allowed dozens of locals to enter the crime scene, unknowingly tampering with evidence and clouding the investigation. Authorities attempted to impose order, but by then, the damage had already been done. Fingerprints were smudged, footprints trampled, and the crime scene, one of the most critical in Iowa's history, was irreparably compromised. The horror of the murders quickly reached beyond Villisca. Within days, newspapers across the country were carrying graphic headlines detailing the slaying of an entire family and their guests. The sheer brutality of the act captivated the public imagination, and the media frenzy only intensified the pressure on law enforcement to find answers. Speculations abounded, some grounded in logic, others bordering on hysteria. Was the killer someone local? Was it a drifter passing through? Or worse, was the murderer still in town, watching the aftermath unfold? In the absence of clear evidence, fear became a dominant force. Families began locking their doors at night, an uncommon practice in Villisca at the time. Children were kept indoors, neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, and whispers about secret grudges and hidden motives became common in church pews and general stores. The very fabric of the community was strained as trust eroded under the weight of uncertainty. Law enforcement officials, desperate for leads, interrogated a long list of suspects. Theories were proposed and discarded at a rapid pace. Some believed the killings were the work of a jealous rival, perhaps someone envious of Josiah Moore's successful business and prominent standing in the town. Others posited that the murderer had religious or ritualistic motives, citing the covered mirrors and methodical nature of the killings as evidence. Still others feared the involvement of a deranged drifter, one who might strike again. Despite an exhaustive manhunt, no credible suspect was immediately found. The axe, Josiah's own tool, taken from a shed on the property, yielded no usable evidence. The killer had left behind no fingerprints, no hair, no trace of blood leading away from the scene. Investigators were left with a terrifying possibility, that this person had not only committed a slaughter but had done so with such precision that he left no trail to follow. The psychological impact on Villisca's residents was profound. The Moore family had been active members of the community, involved in church activities and well-liked by neighbors. Their deaths were not just tragic, they were personal to many. The Stillinger girls, guests in the home for a single night, were from a respected local family. Their inclusion in the massacre introduced a cruel randomness to the violence, deepening the sense of unease. If this could happen to the Moores and the Stillinger children, it could happen to anyone. In the days that followed, local churches held prayer vigils. Ministers spoke of evil, repentance, and divine protection, attempting to soothe the community's fear with faith. Yet, beneath these messages lay an undeniable truth: Villisca had changed forever. The murders were no longer just a crime, they had become a dark chapter in the town's identity, something that would echo through generations. Business suffered as the town's name became synonymous with horror. Tourists avoided the area, and commerce slowed. Realtors found it difficult to sell property, especially those near the Moore house. Local leaders attempted to restore calm, but the unsolved nature of the case made their reassurances hollow. Without a suspect in custody, the fear that the killer might return never fully disappeared. Families altered their daily routines. Some moved away entirely, unwilling to raise children in a place marked by such violence. Those who stayed became more insular, more guarded. Relationships frayed under the weight of suspicion, and long-standing friendships crumbled as people began to wonder whether someone they knew could be capable of such brutality. The case soon attracted outside help. Investigators from neighboring counties, and even from other states, traveled to Villisca in hopes of contributing to the investigation or gaining insight from the crime. Some offered legitimate help, others were charlatans or opportunists drawn to the spotlight. Psychic mediums, amateur sleuths, and self-proclaimed detectives descended on the town, each adding a new layer of confusion to the already murky waters of the investigation. In the midst of all this, the Moore and Stillinger families faced unimaginable grief. Funeral services were held for the victims, with thousands attending to pay their respects. The processions were somber reminders of the lives stolen and the gaping wound left behind. As coffins were lowered into the earth, an entire community mourned, not only for the dead but for the loss of its collective sense of peace. The Villisca Axe Murders had, in a single night, turned a quiet Iowa town into the epicenter of national horror. What followed was not just a search for justice, but a long and painful reckoning with the idea that true evil could walk among ordinary people, and sometimes, never be caught. The formal investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders began under less than ideal circumstances. The initial response was disorganized, with crucial time lost due to the unguarded crime scene and mishandling of evidence. By the time law enforcement attempted to secure the house, more than 100 people had already walked through the rooms, unintentionally contaminating every corner with fingerprints, footprints, and debris. This early misstep would haunt the investigation and cast a long shadow over every lead that followed. Sheriff Hank Horton, already overwhelmed by the shock of the massacre, struggled to coordinate a proper investigative response. Though he was joined by the county coroner and a handful of deputies, their resources were limited. In 1912, forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no DNA tests, no blood typing, no digital databases to search. Investigators relied heavily on observation, interrogation, and intuition. And in a case with 8 victims and no apparent motive, that wasn't enough. Authorities quickly identified the murder weapon, a blood-stained axe left at the scene. The axe had belonged to Josiah Moore himself and was taken from the family's shed. It was returned to the house, used to kill everyone inside, then left in a corner of the guest room. Despite the blood and the brutality, the murderer had been methodical. All curtains were drawn or mirrors covered, suggesting premeditation or a personal ritual. The killer had also stayed in the house for an unknown period after the murders, even preparing a plate of food and lighting a lamp. These chilling details indicated not a hasty attack, but a controlled and deliberate one. The coroner's report confirmed what many had feared: the victims were attacked while sleeping. Most suffered multiple blows to the head, likely from the blunt side of the axe. The wounds were devastating, leaving little doubt that the attacker had acted with extreme force and determination. There were no defensive injuries, no signs of struggle. Whoever had committed the murders did so with chilling efficiency and likely struck each victim while they slept, one by one, ensuring silence throughout the house. With little physical evidence to go on, investigators turned their attention to possible suspects. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator. Jones had once employed Josiah Moore at his hardware store, and their relationship had ended bitterly when Moore left to start his own successful business. Rumors of resentment and professional rivalry spread quickly. Some even speculated that Moore had carried on an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, adding a personal motive to the mix. Jones, however, denied any involvement, and no concrete evidence ever linked him to the crime. Another suspect emerged in the form of Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. Kelly was an eccentric figure, small, nervous, and prone to bizarre behavior. He had even attended the Moore family's church service the night before the murders and left town early the following morning. Later, he sent strange letters to authorities and others in the area, making references to the crime in ways that struck many as suspicious. Eventually, Kelly was arrested and put on trial, but his confession was inconsistent, likely coerced, and his mental instability made his testimony unreliable. He was ultimately acquitted. Other theories suggested that a transient killer had committed the act, perhaps someone jumping trains or moving from town to town. These ideas gained traction due to similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings that had occurred in the Midwest around the same time. Some investigators believed a single person may have committed multiple, nearly identical crimes, though no definitive link was ever established. As weeks turned into months, the investigation grew colder. The sheer volume of tips, many based on hearsay or hysteria, made it nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. Law enforcement was overwhelmed, and the public, desperate for justice, began to lose faith. The lack of results led to frustration and deepened the community's fear that the killer had escaped without consequence. Adding to the confusion were the many self-proclaimed experts and private detectives who inserted themselves into the case. Some sought fame, others financial reward, but few brought any meaningful progress. Instead, their involvement added conflicting theories and fueled public suspicion. The more investigators dug, the more tangled the web became. Eventually, state investigators were brought in, hoping to provide a fresh perspective. They re-examined witnesses, revisited old statements, and tried to reconstruct the night of the crime. Yet, without physical evidence, the investigation remained largely circumstantial. The killer had left no calling card, no trail, and no motive that could be definitively proven. The case became a study in frustration, a high-profile crime with no clear path to resolution. By the end of 1912, interest in the case had begun to fade from the headlines, but in Villisca, the wounds were still fresh. The investigation had yielded no arrests, no convictions, and little comfort for the families of the victims. What remained was an unsettling void, a case so shrouded in silence and missteps that justice seemed permanently out of reach. In the eyes of many, the killer had outwitted the entire system, slipping into the night and disappearing forever. And for a town that once slept with doors unlocked, that possibility was the most terrifying outcome of all. As the Villisca Axe Murders investigation continued to flounder, law enforcement agencies began to look outward. While local suspicions remained focused on personal vendettas or townspeople with hidden motives, others started noticing a disturbing pattern, a possible string of eerily similar axe murders that had occurred before and after Villisca. These comparisons suggested that the Moore family might not have been the only victims of a single, unhinged mind, but part of a much wider, more terrifying phenomenon. If that was true, then Villisca was just one stop on a bloody journey that traversed state lines. Several years before 1912, in communities as far apart as Colorado Springs, Monmouth, Illinois, and Paola, Kansas, families had been slaughtered in their homes by an assailant wielding an axe. These cases shared uncanny similarities with the Villisca murders. Entire households were targeted, victims were bludgeoned in their sleep with the blunt side of an axe, mirrors and windows were covered, and the murderer seemed to linger in the home afterward without fear of being discovered. Often, the killer would use a lamp or lantern with the chimney removed to provide minimal light, exactly like what was found in the Moore residence. In each of these cases, the murder weapon was typically an axe belonging to the victim, taken from their own property. Nothing significant was stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. No dog barked. No neighbor saw a thing. The killer moved with a ghostly silence, committing murders of unspeakable violence and then vanishing before anyone knew a crime had occurred. If this were indeed the same perpetrator, it pointed to a nomadic serial killer, one who struck with surgical precision and left behind only shattered families and cold fear. The idea of a serial killer was not yet widely understood in 1912. The term itself didn't exist in mainstream discourse. Law enforcement in different towns had little means of sharing information efficiently, and cooperation across jurisdictions was minimal. This lack of coordination allowed whoever was committing these murders to remain undetected, free to strike again. In hindsight, many historians believe that Villisca may have been the culmination of a killing spree that had been escalating in brutality over time. One man eventually emerged as a compelling suspect in this pattern, Paul Mueller, a German immigrant and former railroad worker who had been suspected in the brutal 1897 murder of a family near West Brookfield, Massachusetts. That case had gone cold, but authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James, in their book The Man from the Train, made a detailed case linking Mueller to dozens of axe murders across the United States, including the one in Villisca. Their theory suggested Mueller traveled by rail, choosing homes near train tracks, and committing the murders with disturbing consistency. The theory also explained the killer's ability to appear and disappear without trace, using America's vast railway network to vanish into the night before dawn broke. While this hypothesis gained attention decades after the murders, back in 1912, such connections were not seriously explored. Investigators were still focused on immediate suspects with local ties. Unfortunately, this meant that patterns were missed, and opportunities to trace the killer through linked crimes were lost. Towns like Villisca, with their quiet, self-contained communities, were ill-prepared to imagine that such evil could be the work of a stranger who had no reason to hate the victims, only the desire to kill. As rumors of similar crimes spread, fear grew across small towns in the Midwest and beyond. Families began locking doors at night, sleeping with weapons nearby, or sitting in vigil through the dark hours until morning. For the first time, many realized that no place, no matter how remote or peaceful, was truly safe. The idea that a single individual could travel unnoticed from town to town, leaving nothing but carnage in his wake, changed the way people viewed their own communities. The very fabric of American rural life, once rooted in trust and openness, began to fray. Despite growing suspicions about a larger pattern, the Villisca case remained stuck. Without modern tools like centralized criminal databases or forensic labs, the best investigators could do was theorize and speculate. Some were convinced it was a local crime, born from resentment or revenge. Others were drawn to the theory of a transient, perhaps insane drifter with a taste for blood. Each possibility had weight, but none could be proven. And so the truth remained elusive. With time, the idea of a lone, traveling killer faded into legend. Locals clung to their own suspicions, many convinced they had seen the face of the murderer in their own neighborhoods. The debate over who committed the Villisca Axe Murders, and why, became part of the town's identity. It was a scar that never fully healed, and the questions left unanswered gave the tragedy a mythical air. The trail of blood, whether limited to Villisca or part of a broader spree, vanished as quickly as it appeared. No definitive arrest was ever made. No confession ever fully satisfied the facts. And as the years passed, so did the chances of ever uncovering the truth. But in the cold and clinical patterns observed across so many cases, there lingered a possibility too dark to dismiss, that the killer was not known to the victims at all. That the horror of Villisca was not personal, but random. Not born of hate, but of appetite. A predator passing through. A shadow on the train. The Villisca Axe Murders case remained a perplexing mystery, marked by a series of dead ends, conflicting testimonies, and elusive suspects. The tragedy's complexity was deepened by the diversity of theories about who might have committed such a brutal crime and why. One of the more contentious suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a man whose odd behavior and questionable background drew suspicion but ultimately left investigators frustrated and the town divided. Reverend Kelly was a traveling preacher who had passed through Villisca shortly before the murders. Known for his nervous demeanor and peculiar mannerisms, Kelly's presence in town during that fateful weekend quickly became a focal point for suspicion. He had attended a church service in Villisca the night before the killings and reportedly lodged at the local hotel, although his exact movements on the night of June 9 to 10 were unclear. His erratic behavior and cryptic letters to authorities after the murders only fueled rumors. Kelly's reputation was marred by previous allegations of inappropriate conduct, including claims that he was a sexual predator who targeted young girls. In the climate of early 20th century America, where moral panic and suspicion often ran high, such rumors cast a long shadow. Many villagers believed that his presence near the Moore household could not be coincidental. Some witnesses reported seeing him wandering near the Moore home at odd hours, though none could place him inside the house or directly link him to the murders. When authorities arrested Kelly, his mental state became a central issue in the investigation. He was described as unstable, often speaking incoherently and making contradictory statements. During interrogations, Kelly initially confessed to the murders but later recanted, claiming his confession was coerced and that he had no memory of the events. Experts debated whether he was feigning insanity to avoid punishment or genuinely suffering from psychological disturbances. His inconsistent testimony undermined the prosecution's case and left the jury unsure of his guilt. Kelly's trial was a spectacle, attracting widespread attention from the press and the public. Many hoped that the trial would finally bring closure to the grieving community. Yet, despite the evidence presented, including his suspicious behavior and prior accusations, the prosecution lacked physical proof linking Kelly to the crime scene. There was no murder weapon found in his possession, no eyewitnesses who could place him in the Moore home, and no forensic evidence tying him to the attack. The defense argued vehemently that Kelly was a troubled man, but not a murderer. After a grueling trial, the jury acquitted Kelly, a verdict that left many in Villisca unsettled. Some felt justice had not been served, while others worried that an innocent man had been wrongly accused. Kelly's release did little to quell the fear that the true killer was still at large. In the years that followed, rumors persisted that Kelly had confessed privately or hinted at involvement, but no new evidence ever surfaced to reopen the case against him. Beyond Kelly, other suspects were proposed over the years, though none fit the profile of a cold-blooded mass murderer as well as the troubled preacher. Frank F. Jones, the powerful businessman and political figure, remained under suspicion for a time due to his bitter disputes with Josiah Moore, but no evidence connected him directly to the murders. Likewise, a neighbor named William Blackie Mansfield was rumored to harbor resentment toward the Moores, but nothing concrete was ever discovered. The difficulty in identifying the perpetrator was compounded by the fact that the crime appeared meticulously planned. The murderer had covered mirrors and windows, likely to avoid being recognized or seen by victims or neighbors. The killer stayed in the house after the murders, lighting a lamp with the chimney removed to avoid smoke and possibly preparing food. These behaviors suggested a calculated mind rather than a frenzied attacker. Such methodical actions led some investigators to believe the murderer had a personal connection to the family or a deep-seated psychological motive. Despite numerous theories and suspects, one persistent theory grew over the decades, that the Villisca murders were part of a larger series of similar crimes linked by a transient serial killer. This notion gained traction with the work of modern criminologists who studied the patterns of axe murders across the early 1900s Midwest. These experts identified commonalities in the modus operandi, victim profiles, and geographical spread, painting a chilling portrait of a mobile killer preying on unsuspecting families. The theory was that the Villisca murders were not a singular event but a single act within a greater sequence of brutal killings spanning several states. Though no conclusive evidence ever tied the Villisca murders to this broader pattern during the original investigation, the possibility haunted the case and added to the town's unease. Villisca became synonymous with cold, inexplicable violence, a symbol of how evil could strike anywhere, anytime, without warning. The failure to apprehend the killer was a blow to the community and law enforcement. The case's unresolved status created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that lingered for years. Families became wary of strangers, and neighbors watched one another with increased caution. Some even abandoned the town altogether, unwilling to live with the lingering fear. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe murders became an emblem of early 20th century crime investigations' limitations, the lack of forensic tools, the challenges of rural policing, and the difficulty of dealing with senseless violence. While Reverend George Kelly's involvement remains a controversial chapter, his trial and acquittal highlighted the struggles faced by investigators seeking justice amid scarce evidence. Today, the murders remain officially unsolved, the truth lost somewhere in the shadows of time. The story of Reverend Kelly serves as a reminder of the human cost of such tragedies, not only in the lives taken but in the damage inflicted on communities desperate for answers. His name is forever entwined with one of America's most haunting unsolved crimes, a chilling legacy of a night that changed Villisca forever. In the wake of Reverend George Kelly's acquittal, the Villisca Axe Murders case grew colder, but the search for answers did not end. Over the years, numerous other suspects were proposed, each bringing their own set of motives and theories, yet none could be definitively tied to the crime. One of the most compelling suspects was William "Blackie" Mansfield, a neighbor whose reputation and actions aroused suspicion among townspeople and investigators alike. Mansfield was a known alcoholic with a volatile temper, living just a few houses down from the Moore family. His turbulent lifestyle and frequent conflicts with neighbors had made him an unpopular figure in Villisca. Some community members whispered that his jealousy over Josiah Moore's success and standing in the town could have driven him to violence. Additionally, Mansfield's erratic behavior in the days following the murders raised eyebrows. He reportedly disappeared for several hours on the night of the killings and gave conflicting accounts of his whereabouts. To many, this was suspicious enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. Despite these concerns, the investigation into Mansfield yielded little concrete evidence. Unlike Reverend Kelly, who had a documented history of odd and suspicious behavior, Mansfield's connection to the Moore family was largely circumstantial. No eyewitnesses saw him near the house that night, and there was no physical evidence to place him at the scene. Nevertheless, the climate of fear and mistrust that gripped Villisca allowed rumors to flourish, and Mansfield quickly became a convenient scapegoat for a community desperate for someone to blame. Adding to the complexity of the case was the potential involvement of Frank F. Jones, a wealthy businessman and political figure with considerable influence in the region. Jones had a well-known feud with Josiah Moore, stemming from disputes over land, business, and political power. Some speculated that this rivalry could have escalated into deadly violence. Jones, known for his ruthless business tactics, had both motive and means, at least on the surface. However, no direct evidence ever linked him to the murders, and his alibi for the night was never seriously challenged. The multiplicity of suspects reflected a town grappling with its darkest nightmare, each theory attempting to make sense of an event that defied logic. The Villisca Axe murders were so brutal and inexplicable that ordinary motives, jealousy, revenge, greed, felt inadequate. The savage nature of the killings suggested a deeper, more disturbed psyche at work. Investigators also looked beyond Villisca, considering the possibility that the murderer was a transient individual with no personal ties to the victims. This theory gained traction when similar axe murders were documented in other parts of the Midwest. The similarities in method, families bludgeoned in their homes with an axe, windows and mirrors covered to prevent reflection or identification, and no apparent motive, suggested the work of a serial killer. The notion was chilling, a nomadic killer traveling by train, striking at random homes, and vanishing without a trace. One suspect linked to this theory was Paul Mueller, an elusive figure suspected of multiple axe murders in different states. Though no concrete proof ever surfaced connecting Mueller to the Villisca crime, criminologists and true crime researchers have since pointed to his possible involvement as part of a wider pattern of killings. The inability to connect any suspect definitively underscored the investigative limitations of the early 20th century, especially in rural America. Adding to the frustration was the peculiar behavior of the killer at the crime scene. After slaughtering the entire Moore family and their guests, the murderer remained in the house for hours. Lamps were found lit with their chimneys removed, preventing smoke from filling the rooms. The murderer covered mirrors and windows with cloth, possibly to avoid seeing his own reflection or to prevent victims from seeing him. This strange combination of careful planning and chilling brutality suggested a disturbed mind, one who derived some satisfaction or ritual from the act. Despite these eerie details, the investigation was hampered by the forensic technology of the time. Fingerprinting was in its infancy, and DNA analysis was more than half a century away. The lack of eyewitness testimony or reliable alibis left detectives with little to go on. Their best leads were often based on hearsay and local gossip, which clouded the truth rather than clarified it. As years passed, the case settled into the realm of local legend. Villisca became a cautionary tale about the darkness lurking beneath small-town America's surface. The house where the murders occurred was left vacant for some time, a stark reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Later, it was purchased and restored, but it remained a site of fascination and fear. The case's enduring mystery has made it a magnet for paranormal investigators, amateur sleuths, and historians. Stories of ghostly apparitions, unexplained noises, and restless spirits grew alongside the factual record. These tales, while unproven, contributed to the aura of the unsolved crime, embedding it deeply in the cultural memory. Despite decades of speculation, the Villisca Axe murders remain officially unsolved. No suspect was ever convicted, and the true identity of the killer has never been established. The murders left a permanent scar on the town and serve as a grim reminder of the fragility of safety and trust. In a world where justice often depends on evidence and certainty, Villisca stands as a haunting example of the unknowable and the unresolved. The Villisca Axe murders not only shattered the lives of the Moore family and their guests but also profoundly impacted the community and law enforcement's approach to crime investigation in the early 20th century. The brutal nature of the murders, coupled with the baffling absence of a conclusive suspect, transformed Villisca into a place synonymous with fear and mystery. As time passed, the case evolved into a chilling symbol of the limits of justice and forensic science at the time, as well as a grim reminder of how evil can remain hidden in plain sight. The immediate aftermath of the murders saw a town gripped by paranoia and suspicion. Villisca's residents, once tight-knit and trusting, became wary of their neighbors. The idea that someone among them, or someone passing through, could commit such a horrific act without detection shattered the illusion of safety. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and strangers eyed with increasing distrust. The murders were a brutal awakening for rural America, where the belief in community and neighborly protection was deeply ingrained. Local law enforcement, inexperienced with such a gruesome crime, faced enormous challenges. They struggled with limited resources, a lack of forensic expertise, and an overwhelming pressure to solve the case quickly. The investigators' methods, by today's standards, were rudimentary, relying heavily on eyewitness accounts, rumors, and confessions that were often contradictory or coerced. The absence of concrete evidence meant that suspicion was often based on hearsay and prejudice rather than fact. The trial of Reverend George Kelly epitomized these difficulties. His erratic behavior and troubled past made him an easy target, but the lack of forensic proof meant the case against him was largely circumstantial. His acquittal frustrated many but also underscored the dangers of convicting someone without solid evidence. The case highlighted the necessity for improved investigative techniques and the importance of protecting the rights of suspects, lessons that would shape future criminal justice practices. Over the decades, the Villisca Axe murders became a subject of intense speculation, folklore, and even paranormal fascination. The house itself transformed into a macabre tourist attraction, with visitors drawn by the story's enduring mystery. Accounts of ghostly sightings, unexplained noises, and eerie feelings inside the home added to the narrative, blending fact with legend. Whether these tales were genuine paranormal experiences or the result of the mind's attempt to make sense of horror, they served to keep the case alive in public consciousness. The case also had a profound cultural impact, inspiring books, documentaries, and true crime retrospectives. Writers and researchers have attempted to piece together the puzzle from available records, trying to shed light on the mystery that has confounded generations. Each new theory or proposed suspect rekindles interest, reflecting society's ongoing fascination with unsolved crimes and the human need for closure. The inability to solve the murders also exposed the vulnerabilities of small-town policing at the time. Villisca's tragedy demonstrated how isolated communities were often ill-equipped to handle complex crimes and how transient populations could exploit these weaknesses. It highlighted the need for improved communication and cooperation between law enforcement agencies, as well as advancements in forensic science. Modern forensic techniques, such as DNA analysis, advanced fingerprinting, and crime scene reconstruction, have revolutionized criminal investigations, but they came long after the Villisca murders. The evidence collected in 1912, including the blood-stained axe found at the scene, was preserved but never definitively linked to a perpetrator. With the passage of time, much of the physical evidence has deteriorated or been lost, further complicating any efforts at modern re-examination. Despite these limitations, the Villisca case remains a crucial study in early 20th century criminal justice. It illustrates the challenges faced by investigators working without today's scientific tools and the consequences of public pressure to find answers in the face of horrific violence. It also serves as a somber reminder of the victims, 6 children and 2 adults, whose lives were cruelly ended in their own home, leaving behind a legacy of grief and unanswered questions. In the broader context, the Villisca Axe murders are part of a series of similar cases that plagued the American Midwest in the early 1900s, where families were attacked with axes or hatchets, often with no clear motive. These crimes contributed to a growing awareness of the potential for serial violence and the necessity of developing new investigative methods. The case remains a haunting example of how a community's worst nightmare can become a catalyst for change in law enforcement. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe murders stand as a testament to the enduring human quest for justice and understanding in the face of darkness. The story is not just one of brutality and loss but also of resilience, memory, and the hope that someday, the truth will emerge from the shadows. For now, the mystery persists, an unsolved chapter in American crime history that continues to captivate and horrify in equal measure. The Villisca Axe murders case remained officially unsolved, but that did not stop new suspects from emerging in the decades that followed. Among these later suspects was a man named Henry Lee Moore, who garnered significant attention due to a chilling coincidence and a disturbing criminal history. Henry Lee Moore was a serial killer suspected of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe, and some investigators believed he could be connected to the Villisca murders as well. Henry Lee Moore's crimes came to light years after the Villisca tragedy. In 1912 and 1913, Moore was linked to 2 separate axe murders in Alabama, where his mother and grandmother were brutally killed in their homes. These killings bore striking similarities to the Villisca murders, both in method and in the intimate, familial nature of the attacks. Moore was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison for these murders, but his possible connection to the Villisca case intrigued many. The theory was that Moore could have been traveling through the Midwest at the time of the Villisca murders and could have been responsible for multiple axe killings that appeared across different states during this era. These murders often targeted families in their homes at night, with no apparent motive other than perhaps a pathological impulse. The fact that the Villisca murders happened in June 1912, around the same time Moore was active, added weight to the suspicion. However, concrete evidence linking Henry Lee Moore to Villisca was never found. While the modus operandi, the use of an axe and the targeting of entire families, was eerily similar, no direct proof placed Moore in Iowa on the night of the murders. His alibi, movements, and exact whereabouts during that period remain unclear. Some researchers have suggested that the similarities could be coincidental or indicative of a broader pattern of axe murders committed by different individuals inspired by similar impulses or cultural factors. Beyond Henry Lee Moore, the Villisca case attracted many other theories involving traveling serial killers, as the Midwest saw a spate of similar brutal crimes during the early 1900s. The idea of a drifter or transient murderer who moved from town to town, striking seemingly at random, terrified rural communities. The lack of modern communication and forensic technology at the time made it nearly impossible to track or apprehend such a killer. This era was marked by limited law enforcement resources, particularly in smaller towns, where police departments often consisted of just 1 or 2 officers with little training. Communication between different jurisdictions was minimal, and the concept of serial killers as a psychological and criminal phenomenon was not yet widely understood or recognized. These factors allowed dangerous individuals to evade capture by simply moving on before suspicion could fall on them. One reason the Villisca Axe murders remain so haunting is the utter randomness of the violence. The victims were innocent and unsuspecting, caught in their own homes during an ordinary night. The murderer showed no mercy, striking down even the youngest children without hesitation. The cold, methodical nature of the killings suggests a deeply disturbed individual, someone who was either consumed by rage or driven by a pathological need to kill. Over time, many have speculated that the killer must have known the family or been familiar with their routines. The act of covering mirrors and windows after the murders implies a level of awareness and ritualistic behavior that points to a calculated mind rather than a purely impulsive attack. Yet, no suspect ever fit perfectly into this theory. The legacy of the Villisca Axe murders has also been shaped by the broader cultural context of the early 20th century, a time when America was grappling with rapid social changes, increased mobility, and the rise of industrialization. The anonymity afforded by growing cities and the transient nature of the population created an environment where violent crimes could be committed and concealed more easily. The Villisca case encapsulates the fear and uncertainty of this era, where the traditional safety of the home was suddenly vulnerable. Even in modern times, the mystery has continued to inspire renewed investigation and debate. True crime enthusiasts, forensic experts, and historians have revisited the case, applying new techniques and perspectives. Some have used crime scene photos, archived police reports, and witness statements to build fresh theories. Others have explored the psychological profiles of suspects to try to understand the mind behind the killings. Yet, after more than a century, the Villisca Axe murders resist definitive answers. The case stands as a chilling reminder of how a single night of violence can ripple through generations, affecting not just those directly involved but entire communities and the broader society. It remains a stark example of the darkness that can lurk beneath everyday life and the enduring human struggle to find truth amid horror. Ultimately, the story of Henry Lee Moore and other suspects highlights the limits of justice and understanding when faced with such brutality. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about evil, randomness, and the fragility of safety. The Villisca Axe murders remain an unresolved nightmare, a puzzle missing critical pieces, yet forever etched in the annals of American true crime history. The impact of the Villisca Axe murders extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. It influenced how future crimes were investigated and highlighted the vulnerabilities within early 20th century criminal justice. The investigation and subsequent trial underscored the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies that were ill-prepared for such grisly and complex cases. The lack of forensic technology meant that evidence was often circumstantial or anecdotal, making it difficult to identify and convict the perpetrator. This failure contributed to a broader push for reforms in policing and investigative methods. One of the most glaring issues revealed by the Villisca case was the inadequate handling of the crime scene. At the time, crime scene preservation was a relatively new concept, and many officers were unaware of the importance of securing and protecting evidence from contamination. In Villisca, the house was not properly cordoned off, and curious onlookers were allowed inside, potentially disturbing vital clues. Photographs were taken, but the technology was primitive, and the records kept were incomplete. The axe itself, found at the scene and believed to be the murder weapon, was preserved but yielded no fingerprints or DNA evidence that could conclusively link it to a suspect. The community's reaction to the murders also played a critical role in shaping the investigation's trajectory. The public was desperate for answers and justice, which created immense pressure on local officials and law enforcement. This environment sometimes led to rushed judgments, biased accusations, and sensationalized media coverage. The townspeople's fear and suspicion fueled rumors and speculation that clouded the search for the truth. Several individuals became targets of suspicion more because of their personal histories or outsider status than because of solid evidence. The trial of Reverend George Kelly highlighted many systemic flaws. Kelly was a traveling preacher with a questionable past, and his odd behavior during questioning made him an easy suspect. However, the prosecution's case was largely built on circumstantial evidence and dubious witness testimonies. The defense effectively cast doubt on his involvement, and ultimately, the jury acquitted him. This outcome was a blow to the community's hope for closure but also served as a reminder of the necessity for a fair and evidence-based judicial process. The Villisca case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of convicting based on fear and prejudice rather than facts. Beyond the courtroom, the murders prompted discussions about how small towns could better protect themselves from such tragedies. Rural areas often lacked resources, trained personnel, and communication networks that cities had started to develop. The Villisca murders illustrated how these deficiencies could hinder investigations and embolden criminals. As a result, the case contributed to a growing awareness of the need for standardized police training, improved forensic methods, and interjurisdictional cooperation. Over the following decades, these reforms slowly took shape, driven in part by cases like Villisca that exposed glaring weaknesses. The legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders also influenced the cultural landscape. It became part of American folklore, representing a dark chapter in the nation's history where innocence was brutally shattered. The story has been retold in countless books, documentaries, and podcasts, each attempt to piece together the mystery from fragments of history. The house itself has been preserved as a museum and attraction, drawing visitors fascinated by the macabre and unresolved. This blending of true crime and popular culture keeps the memory of the victims alive but also reflects society's complex relationship with violence and tragedy. In academic circles, the Villisca case is studied as an example of early 20th century criminology and law enforcement. Researchers analyze the investigation's shortcomings and the social dynamics at play to understand how such crimes were handled before modern advancements. The case is often cited in discussions about the evolution of forensic science, especially in the use of physical evidence to build cases. While the technology and techniques available today would likely have altered the investigation's course dramatically, the historical context provides valuable lessons on the progression of criminal justice. One of the most profound lessons from the Villisca Axe Murders is the recognition of how vulnerable people can be within their own homes. The idea that violence could invade the sanctuary of family life challenged assumptions about safety and trust. This realization sparked conversations about the nature of evil and the unpredictable dangers lurking in everyday life. The murders became a symbol of random horror, a warning that such acts could happen anywhere, to anyone. The case also underscores the emotional toll on families and communities affected by violent crime. The Moore family's loss was unimaginable, and the ripple effects of grief and fear extended through Villisca and beyond. The inability to find justice added to the trauma, leaving a wound that time could not fully heal. This human dimension reminds us that true crime is not just about facts and theories but about real lives forever changed. Despite the many years that have passed, the Villisca Axe Murders remain a haunting enigma. It stands as a reminder of the imperfections of early criminal investigations and the enduring human desire for answers. While forensic science, law enforcement, and judicial processes have advanced significantly since 1912, this case serves as a testament to the challenges that once defined crime solving. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe Murders shaped the path of criminal justice reform, influenced cultural memory, and left a legacy that continues to captivate. The case's unresolved nature fuels ongoing curiosity and research, ensuring that the story of that fateful night endures. It remains a somber chapter in American history, a chilling reminder of the fragility of safety and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of darkness. The enduring fascination with the Villisca Axe Murders lies not only in the brutality of the crime but also in the enigmatic figure of the killer, someone who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a crime scene frozen in terror. The mystery of the murderer's identity has invited countless theories, but one compelling aspect that continues to intrigue researchers is the psychological profile that might explain such a horrific act. Understanding the mindset of the killer could shed light on the nature of this unsolved crime and the chilling motives behind it. The Villisca murders were characterized by extreme violence, but also by a disturbing level of control and planning. The attacker entered the home at night, ensuring the entire family was asleep or at least unsuspecting, and methodically bludgeoned each member with an axe. The fact that the mirrors and windows were covered afterward suggests a ritualistic element, possibly intended to prevent the victim's spirits from escaping or to avoid the killer seeing his own reflection. Such actions point to a killer who was not merely impulsive but driven by compulsions or beliefs that extended beyond the physical act of murder. Criminologists and forensic psychologists often examine cases like Villisca to understand how certain offenders develop such violent tendencies. One theory is that the murderer may have suffered from severe psychological disorders, such as psychopathy or schizophrenia, which can impair empathy and impulse control. The randomness of the victims, 2 adults and 6 children, suggests an individual who projected internal rage outward, targeting a family unit as a symbol or outlet for deeper frustrations. Another consideration is the possibility of a personal connection or grievance, although no definitive motive was ever established. The lack of theft or sexual assault suggests that the crime was not motivated by conventional gains but rather by an intense, possibly pathological, urge to kill. This kind of motivation is often seen in spree killers or mass murderers who seek control, dominance, or revenge against an abstract target like family or society. The killer's knowledge of the Moore family's home and routines also factors into psychological profiling. The decision to cover mirrors and windows implies familiarity with superstitions or occult beliefs, indicating that the murderer might have had a background or interest in folklore, spiritualism, or ritualistic practices. This behavior is atypical for many violent criminals and hints at a complex psychological landscape, where the murder was both an act of violence and a symbolic ritual. Moreover, the killer's ability to enter and leave the crime scene without detection demonstrates a level of cunning and composure. This was no crime of passion committed in a frenzy, it was calculated, and the killer likely anticipated the consequences enough to prepare an escape plan. Such traits are often associated with organized offenders, individuals who plan their crimes carefully, maintain control over the situation, and exhibit a capacity for manipulation and deception. The community's reaction to the murders also provides clues about the killer's possible profile. The murderer had to be someone who could move unnoticed among neighbors or outsiders. In small towns like Villisca, where residents are closely connected, this often points to someone familiar to the community but not necessarily the family. Suspicion fell on various locals and outsiders alike, but no one matched the complete psychological or behavioral profile. Some experts have suggested that the murderer might have been a transient or drifter, someone who traveled frequently and remained on the fringes of society. Such individuals often experience social isolation, harbor resentments, and may lack strong personal attachments, factors that can contribute to violent behavior. The era's mobility and lack of comprehensive law enforcement coordination allowed these drifters to evade detection easily. Others argue that the killer was possibly a family acquaintance or someone with a personal vendetta. The absence of signs of forced entry suggests the victims may have let the murderer in willingly or that the killer had a key or otherwise easy access. This possibility complicates the psychological picture, suggesting someone capable of hiding dark impulses beneath a facade of normalcy and trust. The psychological analysis of the Villisca killer also considers the cultural and historical context. The early 1900s in America was a time of social upheaval, with rural communities facing economic challenges, shifting social roles, and the influences of modernity. These stressors sometimes manifested in violent outbursts, especially among those who felt marginalized or powerless. The killer might have been someone overwhelmed by personal crises, mental illness, or deep-seated anger against societal changes. Additionally, the methodical nature of the killings indicates a ritualistic or symbolic significance, which may align with psychological theories about killers who seek meaning in their acts. Such individuals often believe they are enacting justice, punishment, or fulfilling some twisted destiny. This mindset can create a dangerous sense of purpose, driving the killer to repeat or escalate their crimes. While much speculation surrounds the psychological profile, the absence of direct evidence means that the killer's true nature remains elusive. Modern forensic psychology relies on crime scene analysis, victimology, and behavioral patterns to build profiles, but without more data, these remain educated guesses. The Villisca Axe Murders challenge investigators to reconcile the brutality of the crime with the subtle clues left behind. The case also highlights the limitations of psychological profiling in the early 20th century, as the field was in its infancy and lacked the tools and frameworks available today. Investigators relied largely on intuition, witness statements, and surface observations. The evolution of criminal profiling as a discipline emerged from cases like Villisca, which exposed the need for deeper psychological understanding of offenders. Today, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to be a subject of study for those interested in the intersection of psychology and crime. The killer's unknown identity fuels ongoing debates about the nature of evil and the capacity for human violence. The unresolved mystery invites questions about how society can recognize and prevent such atrocities, and what drives a person to commit acts so horrific against their own neighbors. Ultimately, the psychological portrait of the Villisca murderer is one of complexity, marked by violence, control, ritual, and enigma. The killer was likely a disturbed individual grappling with inner demons, capable of cold calculation and extreme cruelty. Yet, this same darkness was cloaked in silence, leaving a community shattered and a century-long puzzle that challenges the very limits of criminal psychology. The investigation into the Villisca Axe Murders was a tangled web of leads, suspicions, and dead ends, complicated by the limitations of early 20th century forensic science and the chaotic nature of the crime scene itself. As officers scrambled to piece together what happened, several suspects emerged, each with motives, opportunities, and suspicious behavior, but none could be definitively linked to the massacre. The difficulty of the investigation laid bare the flaws in law enforcement processes of the time and underscored the profound challenge of solving such a heinous crime. One of the first suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a shady past who had been seen in Villisca around the time of the murders. Kelly was known for his eccentric behavior, which included strange writings and confessions that raised eyebrows. His presence in town was documented, and some witnesses placed him near the Moore home on the night of the killings. Kelly's personality and apparent instability made him an easy target for suspicion. However, the evidence against him was largely circumstantial. No physical evidence tied him directly to the crime, and he consistently denied involvement. Although arrested and tried twice, he was ultimately acquitted due to lack of concrete proof. Another person of interest was William "Blackie" Mansfield, a neighbor with a violent reputation who had previously threatened members of the Moore family. His animosity towards the Moores was well known in Villisca, and his familiarity with the neighborhood gave him potential access to the house. Mansfield's erratic behavior and criminal record made him a plausible suspect, yet he maintained an alibi for the night of the murders, and no definitive evidence linked him to the crime. Still, his possible involvement added a layer of complexity, reflecting the sometimes tenuous basis for suspicion in high-profile cases. Detectives also considered the possibility of a serial killer. At the time, several unsolved axe murders had occurred in the Midwest, leading some investigators to speculate that the Villisca killings were part of a larger pattern. The brutal and intimate nature of the murders fit a profile of a killer who used an axe as a weapon of choice, suggesting a psychopathic tendency and a ritualistic approach. This theory opened the door to a wider investigation, but the lack of clear connections between cases hindered progress. Without forensic links or eyewitness testimony, the serial killer theory remained an intriguing but unproven possibility. Adding to the confusion were various local rumors and conflicting testimonies that hampered the investigation. Villisca was a small town where gossip spread quickly, and many residents had their own theories about who could be responsible. Some claimed to have seen suspicious figures near the Moore home, while others alleged that the murders were a result of a family feud or personal vendetta. These rumors often led investigators down false trails, wasting precious time and resources. The challenge of separating fact from fiction was immense in an atmosphere charged with fear and suspicion. One crucial obstacle was the handling of the crime scene. In 1912, there were no standardized protocols for securing a murder scene. As a result, the Moore house was quickly overrun by curious onlookers, neighbors, and even journalists eager to witness the aftermath. This contamination destroyed potential evidence and complicated the work of forensic experts. The murder weapon, a large axe found in the house, was collected but did not yield fingerprints or other definitive clues. Blood samples and other physical evidence were poorly preserved, limiting the scope of scientific analysis. The investigation also suffered from jurisdictional issues. Villisca's local police force was small and inexperienced in handling such a complex crime. Coordination with county and state authorities was inconsistent, leading to fragmented efforts and missed opportunities. This lack of cooperation slowed the investigative process and created gaps that the killer may have exploited. In an era before centralized databases or forensic labs, sharing information was cumbersome, reducing the chances of connecting dots that might have led to an arrest. Despite these challenges, law enforcement pursued various leads over the following months and years. Interviews were conducted, suspects questioned, and searches performed, but each attempt failed to produce definitive answers. Some investigators believed the killer was someone close to the Moore family, while others argued it was an outsider passing through Villisca. The theory that the murderer might have been a local who blended into the community added to the sense of paranoia and distrust among residents. One of the most frustrating aspects was the absence of a clear motive. Unlike many crimes driven by robbery, jealousy, or revenge, the Villisca murders seemed senseless in their savagery. Nothing was stolen, and the victims were bludgeoned in their beds, suggesting a cold, deliberate intent to kill rather than any practical gain. This lack of motive complicated the profiling of suspects and made it difficult to predict the killer's behavior or next move. In the years following the murders, the case became a subject of intense public fascination and media attention. Newspapers sensationalized the story, sometimes sacrificing accuracy for dramatic effect. This media frenzy added pressure on law enforcement but also generated widespread misinformation. The narrative of the axe murderer captured the public imagination, but sensationalism often hindered the pursuit of justice by creating unrealistic expectations and fostering hysteria. The Villisca Axe Murders investigation highlighted the necessity of improved forensic science and police procedures. The case is often cited as an example of how inadequate investigative tools and untrained personnel can impede solving crimes. It also exposed the need for better evidence preservation, systematic interviewing techniques, and interagency cooperation, principles that gradually developed throughout the 20th century. Despite numerous suspects, exhaustive investigations, and repeated trials, the Villisca Axe murders officially remain unsolved. The inability to conclusively identify and prosecute the killer left a permanent scar on the community and set a precedent for the challenges faced in cold cases. It also left open the possibility that the murderer walked free, blending back into society, never facing justice for the 8 lives taken. The unresolved nature of the case continues to inspire amateur sleuths, historians, and true crime enthusiasts who pore over old records, photographs, and testimonies in the hope of uncovering new clues. Technological advances, including DNA analysis and modern forensic methods, have occasionally been applied to preserved evidence, but no breakthrough has yet occurred. Ultimately, the investigation into the Villisca Axe murders remains a haunting example of the limits of early criminal justice and the persistent mystery surrounding one of America's most chilling unsolved mass murders. The case stands as a reminder of the fragility of justice when confronted with brutal crime and the enduring human desire to seek truth, no matter how elusive it may be. The years following the Villisca Axe murders saw a relentless stream of suspects brought before the authorities, each presenting a new twist in the case that captivated the nation. But as investigations dragged on, frustration mounted. No matter how many leads were followed or how many people were questioned, the evidence remained elusive. The mystery only deepened with each passing year, feeding speculation and spawning countless theories about the identity and motive of the killer. Yet, despite the intense scrutiny and numerous trials, the truth stayed hidden in the shadows. One of the most compelling suspects who emerged later in the investigation was Reverend George Kelly. Kelly had a reputation that was far from spotless. He was known for his unstable behavior, erratic sermons, and a disturbing obsession with violence. He had written dark and cryptic notes about murder and death, and some believed these writings reflected his twisted mindset. His presence in Villisca around the time of the murders was well documented, and several witnesses claimed to have seen him near the Moore residence that fateful night. Kelly's arrest was a pivotal moment in the investigation. The prosecution painted him as a man driven by religious fervor and madness, capable of carrying out the brutal killings. However, the case against him was built primarily on circumstantial evidence and his suspicious behavior, rather than concrete proof. His multiple confessions were inconsistent and contradictory, sometimes implicating himself, other times denying involvement altogether. In the trials that followed, the defense successfully cast doubt on the reliability of his statements, and the jury ultimately acquitted him. Though legally free, Kelly's reputation was forever stained, and many believed he was guilty despite the verdict. Another suspect who gained notoriety was William "Blackie" Mansfield, a neighbor with a murky past. Mansfield had a violent temper and was rumored to harbor deep grudges against the Moore family. His familiarity with the area and his known presence in Villisca at the time of the murders placed him under heavy suspicion. Mansfield was arrested and questioned extensively, but he consistently maintained his innocence and provided an alibi for the night of the killings. Without definitive evidence, the case against him faltered, and he was eventually released. Still, his proximity and temperament left a shadow of doubt over him for many years. Adding to the confusion were the theories suggesting the murders might have been the work of a wandering serial killer. Several axe murders had been reported across the Midwest in the years leading up to the Villisca killings. The brutality and weapon choice bore striking similarities, prompting investigators to consider that a single deranged individual was responsible for multiple such crimes. This possibility complicated the investigation, stretching resources thin and muddying the waters with unrelated cases. The lack of forensic connections, however, meant this theory remained speculative. Despite the intrigue it generated, the serial killer hypothesis did little to bring the investigation closer to a resolution. The complexities of the case were further exacerbated by the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Villisca was a small town with a modest police force inexperienced in handling crimes of such severity. Early 20th century forensic science was rudimentary, fingerprinting was in its infancy, and DNA analysis was decades away. The murder scene was mishandled by well-meaning but untrained citizens and officials, contaminating what little evidence remained. Critical clues may have been lost forever as the house was opened up to curious neighbors and reporters, a practice unthinkable by today's standards. Local politics and social dynamics also influenced the investigation. Villisca's tight-knit community was rife with gossip and suspicion, and personal rivalries sometimes colored testimonies. Police officers had to navigate this delicate environment while trying to maintain order and gather truthful accounts. At times, investigators appeared more focused on placating influential town members or avoiding scandal than aggressively pursuing leads. This environment complicated the search for truth and may have allowed the killer to evade justice. One of the strangest elements of the investigation was the deliberate covering of mirrors and windows at the crime scene. The murderer had carefully obscured all reflective surfaces and sealed off light sources, creating a disturbing atmosphere within the Moore household. This unusual detail suggested a methodical mind at work, someone who wanted to control the environment and perhaps delay detection. The psychological implications of this act baffled investigators and added a layer of eerie symbolism to the crime, fueling speculation about the killer's identity and motives. Despite the relentless efforts of police and prosecutors, the judicial outcomes were disappointing. Trials were plagued by inconsistent evidence, unreliable witnesses, and a lack of physical proof. Many suspects were arrested, questioned, and even charged, but the cases against them crumbled in court. The community's desire for justice clashed with the harsh realities of legal standards and the paucity of admissible evidence. Each acquittal or dismissal left a bitter sense of failure, deepening the wound left by the murders. Public fascination with the Villisca Axe murders only grew over time, turning the case into a legend of American true crime. Newspapers sensationalized the story, often distorting facts for dramatic effect. The grisly details, the mysterious killer, and the innocent victims combined to create a narrative that gripped readers and haunted the collective memory of the nation. This attention helped keep the case alive in the public consciousness, but it also led to misconceptions and fueled wild theories that distracted from serious investigation. Modern efforts to solve the case have included revisiting preserved evidence with contemporary forensic technology. DNA testing, unavailable to the original investigators, has been applied to some of the crime scene materials, but results have been inconclusive or compromised by contamination. Historians and amateur detectives continue to study the case, poring over archival records, trial transcripts, and witness statements in hopes of uncovering overlooked details. Despite these attempts, the Villisca Axe murders remain officially unsolved, a chilling reminder of a violent past that refuses to be forgotten. The story of the Villisca Axe murders is one of tragedy compounded by mystery, of a community shattered and justice denied. It exposes the vulnerabilities of early criminal investigations and the profound difficulties of capturing truth amid chaos. The identity of the killer remains unknown, their motives obscured by time, but the impact of their actions echoes through history, haunting the town of Villisca and true crime enthusiasts alike. The case stands as a testament to the enduring human need to understand and find closure, even when the darkness is impenetrable. The Villisca Axe murders case is riddled with puzzling contradictions and chilling unanswered questions, but perhaps one of the most haunting aspects lies in the inexplicable silence of the crime itself, the eerie calm that surrounded the night of June 9, 1912, before the discovery of the bodies. What transpired inside the Moore home in those dark hours remains a mystery, and yet, some fragments of information hint at a grim scenario that unsettled investigators and residents alike. The killer entered the Moore residence sometime during the late evening, likely after the family had settled in for the night. The murder weapon, a heavy axe, likely taken from the house's own tool shed, was wielded with brutal efficiency, striking down each member of the family and their two young guests. The attacks were ferocious but focused, targeting the heads of the victims with repeated blows. Yet, despite the sheer violence, there was a disturbing absence of screams or cries heard by neighbors. No one reportedly saw anyone flee, and the killer seemed to vanish as mysteriously as they arrived. The silence has led many to speculate that the victims were caught completely off guard. The killer may have used the element of surprise, moving swiftly and silently to ensure no one escaped or alerted the town. This implies a cold and calculated mind, one who understood the layout of the house, the habits of the Moore family, and the timing needed to avoid detection. Such knowledge suggested either a local with intimate familiarity or a particularly skilled intruder. Neighbors described the Moore family as peaceful and well-liked, with no known enemies or conflicts that might explain such a brutal attack. Josiah Moore, the father, was a well-respected businessman and community member, while his wife, Sarah, was known for her kindness and involvement in local church activities. Their children were typical of the era, innocent, well-behaved, and full of promise. The presence of the two young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, daughters of a nearby family, was a simple, friendly visit. No motive appeared to link anyone directly to the crime. One of the most chilling elements was the methodical manner in which the killer arranged the victims after the murders. The bodies were left in their beds or on the floor near the bedrooms, with the children found huddled together as if in a final, desperate attempt to shield themselves. The killer did not ransack the house or steal valuables. Instead, the scene conveyed a sense of cold, calculated intent rather than random violence or robbery. The act of covering mirrors and windows with cloth heightened the unnatural aura of the crime. Was it to prevent the victims from seeing their assailant, or perhaps to trap dark spirits as per some old superstition? The answer remains elusive. The crime scene revealed other unsettling details. The killer had taken the time to cover every reflective surface, including mirrors and windows, with sheets or cloth. This act, while mysterious, suggested a possible ritualistic or psychological motive. Some theorized the killer believed that mirrors held souls or that light might reveal their presence. Others speculated it was a symbolic act intended to contain or confuse the victims. Whatever the reasoning, it indicated a disturbed mind with an obsession over control and concealment. The discovery of the bodies was made the following morning by neighbors who noticed the Moore family had not attended church or gone about their usual routines. When Josiah's brother, Ross, went to check on them, he found the front door locked from the inside and had to force his way in. What he saw inside the house shocked the entire community. The sight of 8 bodies brutally murdered in their own home was a horrifying revelation that shattered the town's sense of safety and trust. From that moment, the investigation unfolded amid a whirlwind of fear, suspicion, and speculation. The town of Villisca, once a quiet Midwestern community, became the center of national attention. Reporters descended, locals whispered theories, and law enforcement struggled to piece together what had happened. Despite exhaustive efforts, the killer's identity remained a shadow lurking just beyond reach. In the aftermath, the Moore family story became emblematic of the vulnerability of early 20th century America, how quickly the safety of home could be shattered by a single act of unfathomable violence. The fact that the murderer was never caught added a layer of dread that continues to resonate to this day. Some believe the killer never left town, walking among neighbors as if nothing had happened. Others suggest the crime was the work of a wandering madman, long gone and lost to history. Over the decades, the Villisca Axe Murders have attracted countless investigators, amateur sleuths, and true crime enthusiasts, all seeking to untangle the tangled threads of that night. Some suggest the motive lay in jealousy, others in revenge or madness. Some point fingers at transient workers, local religious fanatics, or even family acquaintances. Yet none have ever been definitively proven guilty. What remains undeniably true is that the brutal slaughter left a permanent scar on Villisca. The house itself stood empty for years, a grim monument to a terrible tragedy. Visitors who later toured the site reported an overwhelming sense of sorrow and unease, as if the walls themselves absorbed the horror that unfolded inside. The echoes of that night linger not just in physical space but in the collective consciousness of all who learn the story. The Villisca Axe Murders remind us that sometimes, evil is both random and intimate, something that can shatter ordinary lives without warning. They illustrate the fragility of safety and the terrifying reality that even the quietest towns can harbor unspeakable darkness. And above all, they challenge us to confront the uncomfortable truth that some crimes may never find closure, leaving their victims and their stories suspended forever in time, haunting the edges of our history. The passage of time has done little to soften the eerie mystique that surrounds the Villisca Axe Murders. Over a century later, the case remains one of the most confounding and tragic unsolved mysteries in American true crime history. As decades passed, investigators and historians have revisited the case again and again, each time uncovering fresh clues, renewed theories, and a complex web of human motives. But with every new investigation, the sense of profound loss and unanswered questions deepens. The Moore family and their 2 young guests are forever frozen in that dreadful moment on June 9, 1912, yet their story continues to resonate because it represents the darkest capacity of humanity. It is a grim reminder of how quickly a tight-knit, trusting community can be shattered by violence that seems both senseless and calculated. The fact that no one was ever convicted only amplifies the tragedy, leaving the case open to speculation, folklore, and chilling legend. One of the lasting enigmas is the absence of a clear motive. The Moore family was well respected and appeared to have no enemies. There was no indication of robbery, no signs of forced entry beyond a door locked from the inside, and nothing stolen. The killer's singular purpose seemed to be the annihilation of an entire family and their guests, without provocation or gain. This aspect has fueled countless theories ranging from personal vendettas to deranged psychopathy, religious fanaticism to mysterious rituals. Yet, no theory has ever held the necessary proof to close the case. The case drew many suspects into its shadow, each reflecting a fragment of the community's fears and suspicions. Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher known for his unsettling behavior and reported mental instability, became a primary suspect. His presence in the area at the time and strange actions fueled speculation, but no conclusive evidence linked him definitively to the murders. He was tried twice and acquitted both times, leaving more questions than answers. Another suspect was Frank F. Jones, a local politician with a contentious history with Josiah Moore. Some believe Jones harbored a deep grudge, but again, no concrete proof connected him to the crime. Others pointed to transient workers, or even a notorious serial killer known as Henry Lee Moore, no relation, who had committed similar axe murders in other states around the same time. Still, none of these leads resulted in closure. The investigation itself was hampered by early 20th century forensic limitations. Modern methods like DNA testing, fingerprinting, or crime scene reconstruction were in their infancy or non-existent. The crime scene was not preserved with the rigor expected today, and much of the evidence was contaminated or overlooked. This procedural gap left investigators grasping at fragments, unable to piece together the full picture. The lack of justice compounded the community's trauma. Villisca's residents lived under a cloud of fear and suspicion, wondering if the killer was one of their own. Families hesitated to let children out alone, doors were bolted tight at night, and rumors spread like wildfire. The Moore house itself became a symbol of horror and grief, eventually falling into disrepair before being preserved as a historic site, a stark reminder of the brutal tragedy. In the years since, the Villisca Axe Murders have transcended the realm of true crime, entering local folklore and even paranormal lore. Visitors to the house report strange phenomena, disembodied voices, cold spots, and feelings of unease that many attribute to restless spirits. Whether these accounts are the product of grief, fear, or something more inexplicable, they have added another layer to the story's enduring fascination. The case also serves as a haunting example of the limits of justice when faced with a calculated act of evil. It underscores the challenges of early crime investigation and the importance of advancements in forensic science. Each revisit to the case highlights how far law enforcement has come, and yet how some crimes remain frustratingly beyond reach. Despite the passage of time, the Moore family and their tragic fate continue to inspire those who seek answers. Amateur historians, true crime enthusiasts, and professional investigators remain drawn to Villisca, determined to uncover the truth or at least keep the memory alive. Documentaries, books, and podcasts have chronicled the murders, expanding public awareness but also complicating the story with competing narratives. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe Murders compel us to reflect on the fragility of safety and the depth of human darkness. They remind us that some horrors are not confined to the past but linger in collective memory, urging vigilance, empathy, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The unsolved nature of this case stands as a testament to the enduring struggle between justice and mystery, one that will continue to captivate and haunt generations to come. The Villisca Axe Murders remain etched into the fabric of American crime history not only for their brutality but also for the profound impact they left on the community and the collective psyche. Over a century later, the echoes of that night still reverberate, through unanswered questions, chilling speculation, and the enduring sorrow of lost lives. The case stands as a solemn reminder of how evil can strike suddenly and without warning, disrupting the ordinary flow of life and shattering the illusion of safety in a small town. The tragedy exposed deep vulnerabilities, both in the Moore family and in the society that surrounded them. It highlighted the limits of early 20th century investigative methods, where a combination of circumstantial evidence and community gossip often guided police work. Without modern forensic science, investigators faced immense challenges in piecing together what happened inside the locked house on that fateful night. The killer's ability to enter, commit the murders, and vanish without trace suggested a level of planning and cold calculation that overwhelmed the investigative techniques of the time. The aftermath of the murders left Villisca shaken. The once peaceful community became a place marked by fear and suspicion, where neighbors eyed each other warily, and everyday routines were altered by the shadow of horror. The Moore home, site of the brutal crime, stood empty and decaying for years, becoming a physical symbol of tragedy. Later preserved as a historic site, it now draws visitors fascinated by its dark past, many reporting an unsettling atmosphere that some attribute to the restless spirits of the victims. The unresolved nature of the case has inspired countless theories and debates. Over the years, investigators have proposed motives ranging from personal grudges and mental illness to religious fanaticism and the possibility of a serial killer's involvement. Each suspect brought into focus different aspects of the community's fears and tensions, but none were conclusively linked to the crime. The failure to identify or convict the perpetrator has fueled speculation and kept the mystery alive. The case also underscores how grief and trauma can ripple outward through generations. The Moore family's descendants, along with the community of Villisca, have carried the weight of loss and unanswered questions for decades. Their story became more than a tragic event, it became a cautionary tale about vulnerability, evil, and the quest for justice. This ongoing emotional resonance continues to inspire efforts to understand and remember. In the broader context, the Villisca Axe Murders reflect themes common to many unresolved crimes: the fragility of safety, the limits of human understanding, and the haunting presence of the past. The case exemplifies how some horrors defy closure and how the search for truth can become a lifelong pursuit for those touched by tragedy. It challenges law enforcement, historians, and society to confront uncomfortable realities and to acknowledge that some darkness may never be fully illuminated. The enduring fascination with Villisca also speaks to the human desire to make sense of senseless violence. True crime enthusiasts, paranormal investigators, authors, and filmmakers continue to explore the story, each adding layers to its mythology. The murders have transcended their historical moment to become a part of American cultural memory, reminding us of the delicate balance between light and shadow in human existence. As time moves forward, the legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders remains a powerful testament to the resilience of memory and the importance of justice, even when justice is elusive. The case invites reflection on how communities heal, how families cope with unimaginable loss, and how society grapples with the unknown. It is a story that warns of the darkness that can lurk beneath ordinary lives and compels us to remain vigilant in the face of evil. Ultimately, the Villisca Axe Murders stand as a solemn monument to those who lost their lives too soon, to a community forever changed, and to the enduring mystery that still challenges us to seek answers. The story is not just about a crime but about the profound human need to remember, to understand, and to find meaning in the face of tragedy. It is a chapter of history that continues to haunt, to educate, and to remind us of the shadows that sometimes fall across even the most peaceful places. Thank you for joining us as we unraveled the haunting mystery of the Villisca Axe Murders, one of America's most chilling unsolved crimes. The story of the Moore family's tragic fate reminds us how fragile life can be and how some questions may never find answers. If you found this video gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Have any theories or thoughts about this case? Drop them in the comments below. We love hearing your insights and speculations. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes, the darkest mysteries lie just beneath the surface. This is Mr. Darsnights, signing off.